Hi, everyone. So my aim here is to present some thoughts I've been thinking during the course of the day to hopefully kick off some kind of discussion. But I really want to encourage members of the audience as I'm speaking to get your thoughts in order about any overarching themes that you would like to hear more about from all of our speakers before we close for today. And also for our speakers, if you have questions for other speakers that you didn't get to, let's all just be thinking. I think I want to start with a question that Dr. Coy threw out a while ago about the specificity of our discussion today, about the specificity of responsibility in relation to genetics, as opposed to our thinking about responsibility more broadly. And I think this question about whether we need to think about responsibility differently in the context of genetics than in similar, more traditional contexts, like just thinking about heredity or human similarity, things like that. And then also thinking about responsibility just generally as a philosophical concept is a really important one. And I think from our very first talk today, that's been hovering in the background here. So I heard three reasons that I want to highlight for thinking that there is something very specific about genetics in relation to responsibility. The first is maybe just the obvious one, that genetics has specific mechanisms by which it works. So the way that it will exert control or not over human beings will be different from other kinds of control. But I think, as was highlighted in that final exchange in the last Q&A, and also as people have been referencing throughout the day, this specificity is for the most part theoretical rather than concrete for us with relation to many of the behavioral traits that we really care about. However, I think that as our knowledge in behavioral genetics increases, the specificity of our explanations will only expand. So we need to anticipate that. A second place where I think we need to be concerned about the specificity of genetics vis-a-vis responsibility has to do with the intersectional implications of popular thinking about responsibility in genetics, as we heard from Dr. Murchison's, I think, very crucial intervention here. So this sort of specificity grows out of the way that racist structures in medicine and in science have shaped our discourse, as well as the history of eugenical violence towards those with disabilities, which makes the moral questions in this realm I think very particular. And then a third thing that I heard that I think is worth highlighting is that even if in some ways genetics is a stand-in for other concepts among lay people and maybe some professionals these days, if maybe it's standing in for something like inheritance more generally, or something like human essence, or something like that part of us that's determined, it still might have a specificity. So there might be some concept of what the genetic is that's featuring in the public imaginary or in the minds of scientists or clinicians that we need to be responding to carefully and thoughtfully. Okay, so given all that, it seems like there does need to be a particular rhetoric for thinking about responsibility in relation to genetics. And the question, of course, is like, what is that rhetoric? How do we want to shape it? How do we want to think about it? One important theme that I saw emerging, I think especially from Dr. Parker's comments, also from Dr. Applebaum's early in the morning, is the thought that it's not going to fall out of the science, right? So even if our behavioral genetics gets better, even if we have explanations that we can have more confidence in, it will not be clear what that means for our thinking about our own responsibility for our own traits that are caused by our genes, our responsibility towards others, given the genes that they have inherited. These are normative questions. And one fallout of the work that Dr. Applebaum described that he and I completed along with Matt Lebowitz is that people seem to think in ways that may appear irrational about genetics if we expect them to respond purely on the basis of the science. So in our research, we saw that people respond asymmetrically when they think about the repercussions of people having genes for prosocial or antisocial behavior. And we may expect that insofar as having a gene for prosocial behavior or antisocial behavior each would determine your behavior to a similar extent, we may think that people should think that responsibility will accord equally to those different sorts of traits. Sorry, there's a siren. And we found that that wasn't true. And Dr. Heifetz, in her comment, encouraged us to think carefully about these kinds of differences, that it may really depend on the context, how people, what people's intuitions are about the relationship between genetics and responsibility. And I want to suggest that I think that may not be irrational at all. That may just be the fact that what is really shaping people's intuitions is not scientific information, but rather their longstanding norms and modes of thinking about moral responsibility. So if that's right, then I think we need to be careful when we think that the answer is always more scientific literacy. It may be that people learning more about how genetics mechanisms function simply won't help, because what we actually need is more careful ethical thinking. I don't know that I think that's true, but I think we should all be asking that question about kind of which arena it's appropriate to intervene in here. And I want to emphasize by that, I don't mean to suggest that the facts of the matter about genetics are irrelevant here. And I think this came through very beautifully in Dr. Martin's remarks, that what is going on in the science will always affect the kind of regimes that we use to think and live with genetics. I think another very potent example of this right now is precision medicine, where the virtue of precision has started shaping people's ideals about explanation in a way that I think has major implications for medical ethics. And then, yeah, finally, I just wanted to say how much I liked Anna Lewis's question for one of our speakers about what kind of response we would like families and other service users to have when they receive genetic information. I think we don't ask this question enough, and I think it's a very interesting way to kind of invert some of the discussion that we commonly have on this topic. If we started with answering that question of what would be the ideal response, I think what we will see pretty quickly is I don't think we really know. I mean, those of us who work in this field and think about this all the time, I don't think we really know. And I think it's because a lot of the information that's communicated when genetic information is communicated is not actionable. It's not actionable even in the kind of nebulous realm of our self-concept or of how we treat others. I think we ourselves, and by that I mean scientists, I mean theoreticians, I mean clinicians, are ambivalent often about what the significance of this kind of knowledge is. So I just wanted to highlight that as I think a very helpful way to think about approaching this question and kind of reverse engineering from what we think would be a sort of healthy response to this kind of information. I do think that one thing we can say, coming away from these talks, is that I think a consensus formed over the course of the day that we want to discourage a kind of individualism, that when people receive genetic information and think about it purely in terms of themselves and their lives, they're missing a broader social context where genetic information increasingly has a kind of alarming degree of power, and where decisions really matter for people beyond the individual. So I will stop there and invite any of our panelists to chime in, or anyone in the audience to ask a question. Yes, okay.
Yeah, perhaps I can start this final panel discussion by picking up your point about the specificities of genetics. And I have 2 points, also depending, informed, so to say, by the discussion we had today, but also, of course, about of the amount of empirical research that has been done in the last decade on the different areas. So the first of all, my personal observation is that that many things we have discussed here might be not so specific for genetics but we might or also should be sensitive to other areas in medicine, especially what is so-called personalized medicine, where this trend of having biomarkers providing risk scores based on neurological blood markers, information, blah, 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 all these type, I think I would expect, and also part of our own research on neurological biomarkers, for example, and physiological biomarkers in predicting dementia, somehow indicates that there are a lot of parallels of what we have discussed today. So that's one thing. So still, I think there might be the question whether there still remains something super specific about genetics. I would not deny, but brings me to another point is somehow I feel a bit uncomfortable about the genetics, because I feel that the many studies that have been conducted empirically, but also theoretically, often focus on a broad field of diseases, and all these diseases, or where genetics is developed as diagnostics, or now even part of treatment or therapeutic approaches, I think you always have history and the cultural context of the diseases where this type of genetics pops up, so to say. And I feel that it really is crucial always to have this cultural historical context of a disease in mind when we talk about genetics responsibilities and the involved actors, whether they are individuals, families, professions, or institutions. And this somehow, so to say, is a play for having always the comparative eye, so to say, on how these questions play out in different fields of application.
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear what you think then about Lucas's final question about as you know, and I think our last two speakers mirror the sentiments of many of us in saying that this might be a hypothetical worry, but if genetics proves itself useful in moving beyond explaining our pathologies and into explaining other aspects of our character, to what extent then we need a different discourse, given the historical grounding in disease that you just emphasized?
So you mean if we have kind of scientific evidence or that genetics cause or is the only cause for all the diseases we have? Or I'm not
so Lucas brought up the use of genetics and thinking about educational attainment and success. Hi, Lucas.
Hi.
Do you want to expand on that?
Sure, yeah. One of the big things that I've been tracking in my research is the application of polygenic testing to non-medical traits. So they've done genome-wide association studies of the number of years of schooling a person completes in their life, or household income, a range of non-medical traits that now you can provide to the public genetic information about how maybe genes influences these behaviors. And it seems to me to be a new domain, a new application of genetics that I believe likely raises new questions.
Okay, yeah, now I got it. Yeah, but then again, I think I would just like to transfer my observation that also the way how we understand education is, I think, very culturally framed. I mean, how we think it's important, what is it a factor to make your life, to be successful, and so on. Should it be a relevant factor or not? And then I think I also just share Paul's observation, sorry, that I think also in Germany there's no debate. So I think it's, again, I would say, isn't it again interesting that this seems to be a specific North American issue, perhaps? And what does it tell us? This is my European perspective on that discourse.
Paul, do you want to jump in? Paul Martin?
I don't want to, I mean, I maybe come come back to this specific point in a second, but I'm interested in what people feel, the panel feels about what I would regard as the most significant sort of structural change that's going on, and that's the massive expansion of data coming from whole genome sequencing. So maybe this is a particular UK perspective, but it's just been announced today that the government are going to integrate on an opt-out basis all the medical records in the NHS for patients. I've not followed this story, I only heard it about an hour ago. So, but this is an attempt to go back to something they've been trying to do for a while, which is build this massive database of integrated genomic and personal medical information. And I know in Denmark that there are other sort of fantasies sort of around aspects of that. Maybe this is more a European thing because of the national health services, but I think what we're going to see with the expansion of whole genome sequencing is this enormous amount of genomic data out there. Now, what exactly that means, I don't know. I'm not making any claims per se, but I think that's going to be the big game changer structurally, is that we're going to have a lot more of this data floating around, and there's going to be all sorts of claims then made. And I think polygenic risk scores, that question that was asked about, is there going to be a new regime and normativity around that? I think these claims about educational attainment are just the first sign of the broadest cultural and social significance of that massive expansion of this type of data, all sorts of ways in which that's going to be mined and exploited for different purposes. So I just wonder if people feel that that is something, maybe, you know, from a North American perspective, be interesting to see if you think that's coming down the track, but certainly from the UK perspective, that is foursquare and central to public health policy in the UK in terms of the future imaginary of where the whole healthcare system is going. It's going to have genomic data everywhere. And so I think these narratives around the responsibility will be reshaped in the light of that.
Yeah, there's also another sense of responsibility that we didn't talk about so much today that was just brought up in the chat by somebody who wrote, given the recent HSE hack in Ireland, what could possibly go wrong if we save genetic data in a national database? So there's an additional form of responsibility that that our state institutions have around privacy and control. Did anyone want to weigh in on Paul's question about, especially, I think it's interesting in the comparative transatlantic context to think about this. Lucas, did you want to?
Well, I actually wanted to follow up on the comment from the anonymous attendee, but it does connect with Paul's point about whole genome sequencing producing so much new and very large amounts of data. A related issue that's happened with the UK Biobank is the access of genomic data by race-oriented researchers who are investigating questions that the behavior genetics community at large believes are not valid and not worth asking. But it's part of having open science. It's part of having large genomic databases that is giving rise to some controversial scientific research, and that can also connect to responsibility and what sort of responsibilities we have as research scientists to funnel the sort of questions that get asked. Yeah, that's all I had there.
We also have a question, general question from Bob Klitzman in the chat about precision medicine and about whether it is being oversold, and if so, what we should do or say. Paul, I'm sure you have thoughts about this. Anyone want to?
I mean, I'm sure it's been a bit oversold, but I suppose I think again, coming from the UK perspective, what's really striking is the persistence of this genomic imaginary in policy over 20 or 30 years, in which genetic causation of disease is absolutely central to it. It's now articulated through this notion of precision medicine or whatever. But I think it's sometimes not clear to me what's sort of driving that. I mean, clearly in the oncology field, I think we can see real progress being made in disease stratification and the way that's cashing out in terms of therapeutic advances. But beyond that, I'm, skeptical. I think we have to call for a strong evidence base for these things to be introduced. And I think that's easier in some countries than others. In the context of where you have strong HTA regimes, that becomes possible. But I have to say there's all sorts of ways now in which exceptions are being made to that through exemptions, accelerated access programs, things like that. So yeah, I think it's a real conundrum. I can't quite tell exactly where all the momentum's coming from. It's not just simply commercial. I think there's a lot of investment in the scientific community in the idea of stratified or precision medicine. So I just think, you know, more open debate about how effective it is in reality and questioning some of these claims is going to be the way forwards.
Yeah, I think that's completely right. One reason I see for maybe being careful about seeing precision as just a synonym for genomic is that the power of that term to get things done, that is to get science funded, I think is showing itself on a few different fronts. So in the United States, precision is now, or was, I mean, things are changing, but in the early years of the 21st century was the term of choice within psychiatry. So the NIMH, when they introduced the research domain criteria project, this new kind of attempt to wrestle control away from the DSM in our thinking about psychiatric explanation, they called that precision psychiatry, but they weren't referring to psychiatric genetics, which they've all, you know, more or less lost hope in. They were referring to neuroscience, and so Thomas Insel introduced this idea that psychiatry just should be clinical neuroscience or applied neuroscience, and used the language of precision for that. So I think the word itself has taken on a kind of power, even abstracted away from genetics. There's another question in the chat, kind of going back to this earlier interest in responsibility in the sense of the protection of private information. So this attendee writes, given how prevalent the push for, as Paul said, genomic data everywhere, how easy will it be to opt out of genetic data collection? Would anyone like to speak to this concern? Yes, look.
I can just speak about my observations here in Germany. And it's interesting that in particular, Germany is often very strong when it comes to data protection law, at least in comparative terms. However, I think it will become less and less possible, so to say, to opt out, because also here, and I think that there's this ongoing debate in bioethics, there is this idea to replace informed consent by broad consent, to use clinical data for all kinds of data-driven research. And even if their existing consent, how do you say, forms point out that genomic data has a specific meaning, there's specificity about this. I think it's so packed and integrated in this whole process. I'm quite sure that a lot of people are not able, so to say, to opt out. Even if there is this kind of option, so to say, in the informed consent, but just speaking in practical terms, people have to sign such forms often under time pressure, and so I think it will be more like there will be a legal option to opt out, but I think socially it will be less and less practical, and this concerns me very much. And this is why I'm also very critical towards this idea of broad consent, for example.
So let me offer a somewhat different perspective on that, which ends up, I think, in the same place, which is we don't have to imagine government coercion to for broad scale genetic data collection, right? For some purposes that exists already here in the United States. Felons and many misdemeanants who are arrested have mandatory collection of their genetic samples. Migrants who come into the country illegally can be forced to provide DNA samples for their tracking as well. But I think that's going to remain the minority of cases. What's going to happen, what is happening, is that the medical care system in increasingly switching over to a genetic paradigm of illness and perhaps, as I think Paul was suggesting, treatment is simply going to demand of its patients to voluntarily provide the samples that will allow medical treatment as it is becoming to be conceptualized to take place. So you'll go to your physician, your specialist, or your primary care physician, and he or she will say, okay, now, we're going to draw your cholesterol level, your blood lipid level, and a variety of electrolytes just to see how you're doing. And of course, I'm a little worried about that wheeze you have, and we're going to work that up by genotyping you for some of the common variants that are associated with asthma and chronic pulmonary conditions. You could say no, but the fact of the matter is no one does in that circumstance. And the failure to say no will mean that we will continuously build and expand the data set available about all of us that exists within the medical treatment system. That may then go on to be used for research, either because broad consent is obtained or because those data are de-identified. And in many systems, including the American system, de-identified data can be used without patients' consent, given certain kinds of regulatory approvals. So it's going to happen, but I don't think it's going to happen in a nefarious way. It's going to happen in the context of a benevolent system that nonetheless is going to ultimately have all our genetic information interoperably linked and available for good purposes, but potentially for bad ones as well.
Eric, did you want to chime in here?
I wanted to thank you, Katie. I don't want to prematurely end us, but that's why we're getting close. Yeah. Let's see if there's another question before I thank you and everyone else.
Well, we have a question in the chat. We have a hand up also, which I think came first, from Ellen Clayton. Ellen, do you want to unmute? Okay.
No, I was going to say, I mean, Paul is right about the information being in the healthcare system. That actually has some protections, not great, but some. The big issue is the directed consumer genetic testing, which is more than 30 million people in this country, which is almost twice as many as what's in the criminal justice system, with much more information, and that you have no control over, because your relatives can all do this, and once they're in it, you're in it. So it's really quite a big issue. So I would say yes, health system, research less so, because that's better protected. But the elephant in the middle of the room is the directed consumer genetic testing. So now I'll be quiet.
All right, well, maybe that's a good place to draw things to a close, Eric.
Wow, that was an incredible day of talks. Thank you, Katie, for the wonderful synthesis. Thank you to all of the speakers for really just beautifully organized, clear talks. I feel incredibly lucky to be part of a conversation that includes psychologists and philosophers and anthropologists and sociologists. It's just remarkable. It is quite a privilege. So I'm grateful to have had it today. Thank you all. I hope everybody has a terrific weekend. And unless anybody else on the panel needs to say anything else, why don't we say thank you?
I need to say something else. I think we all owe you, Eric, and the organizing committee our thanks for putting this whole thing together, which we know took a lot of work to pull off in the smoothness with which the day went, and as terrific as the talks were, is all a result of the amount of effort and coordination that went into this in advance. So Thank you and the other members of the organizing committee.
Thank you. It was very much a team effort. Alas, one team member, Ruth Ottman, is I think on the call, but not present. She's in California. Yes, it was a group effort. Thanks to all. I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend. Be well. Thank you,
Thank
Paul.
you.